Good morning for those of you on the Central and Pacific times, and good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. My name is Moshe Schwartz, and I will be moderating today's panel, Optimizing Defense Acquisition, Communication, Industrial Impact, and Capital Integration. We have 4 presentations, each one of which drills down into a different aspect of the defense industrial base and how to strengthen that base. I'll present first the paper that I worked on, which is called What We've Got Here is a Failure to Communicate, How Better Communication Can Improve DoD Acquisition Outcomes from Requirements to Budgeting to Performance. Then we'll move on to Amanda Bresler, who's the Chief Strategy Officer of PW Communications, who's presenting a paper assessing the impact of DoD weapon systems on the defense industrial base. Then Sam Moyer from NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute, presenting a paper, Tactics to Strengthen the Defense Industrial Base with Private Capital. And then Lindsay Cross, who's a senior analyst at GAO, talking about Navy shipbuilding and ship repair industrial base. So we'll just get started. If we can have the slides up, please, for the first presentation. What we've got here is failure to communicate. For those of you who are Paul Newman fans, hopefully you'll get that reference to Cool and Luke. And first, let me thank my co-authors, Shel Johnson and Donnie Schwartz, who helped with this paper, or really probably did most of the work and let me carry on for the ride. So I appreciate their putting up with me. And what we thought here is, at the end of the day, acquisition is a human endeavor. And the success or failure of those acquisitions depend primarily on the people who make up the acquisition workforce and the people they work. That is the thought that we had. And because of the human element in contracting, relationships and communication matter. We're not suggesting that they are all that matter. Contracts, budgets, they all matter. But relationships and other elements, they share a common thread. The need of effective communication, be it budgeting or contracting, they all need effective communication, which we believe is success to any organization, and DoD is no exception. So why do we write this paper? In our careers, we have done a lot of research, written dozens of papers, participated in numerous conferences on defense acquisition. And we were just talking and we were struck that in all our conversations, communication keeps coming up, and it's not an ancillary point, but a core issue running throughout the entire acquisition process. So what did we find when we embarked on that theory? So let's just jump right in. If you look at, next please, the DoD Strategic Management Plan, we pulled out this quote because next, I want to point out 2 words. Next, please. Communication and collaboration. The DoD Strategic Management Plan specifically calls out that you need communication and collaboration to have innovation. But that's not the only time these words pop up. Next, please. When you delve into a study that was written on the history of consortia and why they were established, we'll see these exact same words. Next, here they are again, that one of the reasons or one of the main drivers of establishing consortia was to encourage collaboration and communication between government and diverse industry teams. And we see this even in, and the prior panel was talking about this, the IP guidebook that just came out. They talk about it again, the need for communication, the need for collaboration and coming up with things together. So with that, the first question is, how is DoD doing? And we can see that perhaps not as well as we would like. So the National NDIA, where Sam is, they did a study and they asked the question, is there good communication between government and industry? And the yellow, the answer, 36, more than a third of people said no, and less than 20% said yes. And that seems to be a theme. So for example, next, you can see again, I'm sorry, the slide that you just showed was DoD's own data. I apologize. That was DoD's own data. And NDIA had a similar finding when they were asked what is difficult about government acquisition processes. 58% of people who responded said unclear or changing requirements. Unclear or changing requirements is a communication issue. And when they were also asked the question, what can DoD do to improve its ability to work with industry? 53% of government respondents and 65% of industry respondents said provide clear, consistent demand signal. This is all about communication, clarity of communication and consistency of communication. Now, I'll point out, this isn't just another number. If you look at, for example, the 58% unclear or changing requirements, that was the most common answer that was given. That scored higher than any other issue that there was. So this is a major issue. And it's not just actually communicating and talking. Actions speak louder than words. Next, please. Right. And so how DoD responds and how they do things often is itself sending a message. For example, as we'll see here, you can look at the regulatory process. When proposed rules are published, it's really getting industry and others spun up as to what's coming down the pipe. But the years it takes to publish and how long it takes is sending a message of seriousness and how DoD is acting. So you could see on the, I think it's your right, there are still cases, 14 cases from 2023 that are still pending, but it's not just that. There are 9 cases from 2021. There are cases actually dating all the way back to 2015 and 2017. This is in fact sending a message. Another example is bid protests. So in bid protests, next please. With bid protests, there historically has been reluctance by DoD to have a real substantive conversation in the debriefs. And there was a RAND report on this. And so ultimately what Congress required is these expanded debriefings. Why? Why was DoD reluctant? So the research that we did indicates DoD was reluctant because they were concerned that if they provide certain information in the debrief, that will be used against them to file protests. Well, but there are 2 consequences to it. The first consequence is if you're not talking to industry about why they lost the bid, they're going to think DoD is hiding something. And because they're going to think DoD is hiding something, they're actually more likely to protest. And we've seen this type of research when it comes to surgeries with doctors and bad outcomes. We've seen it in other areas too, that the shutting down of communication leads people to think, well, maybe there's something nefarious here. So these enhanced debriefings is what Congress called them, serve that point of actually decreasing bid protests. But the other issue is if a company loses a protest, a good debriefing could help them figure out how to bid better next time. And really, isn't that what DoD wants at the end of the day and the other agencies? Better bids and more competitive bids so they have more options. And we see how good communication can really lead to more competition. So for example, there was a call for papers by solid rocket motors by DoD's Defense Industrial Base Consortium. And we spoke to DoD people and they expected 10 to 15 responses. They didn't get 10 to 15 responses. They ended up getting 60 responses. The question is, why did they get 60 responses? And we spoke to them about it. And they said it was a number of reasons, including they worked very closely with the prime contractors to help get subcontractors to submit papers, because this was for components and other things below the prime. They did a lot of communication, for example, at the conference, the opening conference of the DIB consortium. And they focused on requirements. So if it's communicating throughout the requirements process, throughout the solicitation, throughout the evaluation process and award. And it's not just award, it's post-award as well. We've heard from contractors that once the contract was awarded, the government teams are heads down on executing. But sometimes as a contract starts being performed, the contractors realize, you know what, there's a better way to do this. And it's not necessarily a way that is more expensive. It could even be cheaper or more efficient or faster. But in that post-award stage, there isn't necessarily that mechanism for saying, hey, let's re-examine some of these requirements and is there a better way to do it? It's also just not an industry problem. DoD has had some challenges communicating with Congress. We pulled this quote out of a report from the Appropriations Committee. When DoD asked for additional budget flexibility to move money, the response of the committee was additional budget flexibility is based on the presumption that trust exists between the legislative and executive branches. And this last sentence is stunning. They said this presumption presently is false. And that, at the end of the day, is a communication breakdown. So we came up with a framework for communication, of having meaningful communication, not just formulaic opportunities for communication, having it really be two ways, and really building an established relationship that does trust. But really, I think at the end of the day, our conclusion is DoD needs to leverage the US capital markets. And I know the other people are going to speak about that. And they really need to leverage the full strength of domestic industry. And to do this, DoD has to be a better customer. And the key to being a better customer and expanding the defense industrial base and getting better requirements comes at the end of the day down to effective communication. With that, perhaps let's turn now to Amanda to talk about her paper. Amanda, please.
Great, thank you very much. I will let you pull up my slides. Thank you. Good afternoon. It's great to be here with everyone, albeit virtually. My name, as Moshe said, is Amanda Bresler, and I'm the president of PW Communications. Today, I'll be discussing my paper titled Assessing the Impact of Department of Defense Weapon Systems on the Defense Industrial Base. Next slide, please. Each year, about 20% of Department of Defense contract dollars are directed into major weapon systems, otherwise known as equipment programs, or as I'll refer to them in shorthand, EPs. Our research examines this spending and evaluates how it aligns with America's national security priorities. Next slide, please. We started by aggregating contract award data from the Federal Procurement Data System, or FPDS, which is the centralized real-time database for government procurement transactions. FPDS contains a structured field for equipment program, so we then isolated contracts funded and awarded by the DoD from fiscal year 2013 through fiscal year 2023, for which that field was completed. Next, we grouped the contract actions by their associated equipment programs and excluded those with a negative or $0 total spend. From fiscal year 2013 through fiscal year 2023, we found that the Department of Defense allocated more than $880 billion to 440 distinct weapon systems, while hundreds of equipment programs have received less than $100 million total. We found that the majority of EP spend is concentrated in the multi-billion-dollar weapon systems. Specifically, 16 weapon systems received nearly 2/3 of all EP spend. Next, we were interested in understanding the pool of companies that received EP contracts. We joined the Unique Entity Identifier, or UEI, for each EP-associated contract action, grouped the contracts by their UEIs, and filtered for distinct UEIs. Many large contractors operate with multiple UEIs, so we manually joined UEIs for entities clearly associated with the same parent company. For the last 30+ years, the defense industrial base has also experienced significant consolidation. Many of the largest DoD suppliers have combined, like Northrop Grumman's acquisition of Orbital ATK, Lockheed's acquisition of Sikorsky, and L3 acquiring Aerojet, to name just a few. For the purposes of our analysis, we reviewed the parent companies with the most in EP awards, and in instances when we were aware of an acquisition event, we consolidated the companies to the acquiring parent company. However, in instances where two primes formed a joint venture, we treated the joint venture as its own entity. As a final step, we filtered the entities to exclude those with less than $1,000 in total EP-associated contract awards. Using this methodology, we identified 5,677 companies in receipt of EP-associated contract awards during our analysis period. Yet more than 93% of all weapon system spending went to just 31 of these companies. Now, I'll be discussing this in more detail later, but it's important to point out that reliance on such a small number of suppliers for our most critical weapon systems poses significant security risks. Next, we wanted to understand the geographic composition of the EP supplier base. For each company, we joined location data from FPDS and grouped the companies by state. For more than half of all states in the US, EP vendors based there received more than $1 billion in weapon systems contracts during our analysis period. Likewise, looking at the distribution of EP funding by place of performance, more than half of all states received over $1 billion in EP-associated contract dollars. Given the size and the tactical significance of these programs, and the fact that spending is consolidated in so few suppliers, congressional oversight is critical. Yet the fact that these programs drive such substantial revenue into so many states all but guarantees them and their suppliers political cover. Next slide, please. It's no surprise then that EPs are notoriously late, over budget, and underperforming. We've all seen the headlines about billions in cost overruns for prominent programs like the F-35 and the Arleigh Burke. And in fact, the GAO has been reporting on ballooning costs of weapons systems as early as 1970. Another important consideration in light of these persistent cost and performance issues is the fact that a majority of the largest EP suppliers are publicly traded. The fact that these firms serve as the backbone of the most significant weapon systems in America does not absolve them of their fiduciary obligation to maximize shareholder value. How then do they balance the need to maximize shareholder value if and when doing so is not in the best interest of America's national security? For instance, if a changing threat landscape requires a supplier to abandon production in a certain part of the world, from the perspective of shareholder value, it could be better for the supplier to fight or delay this change rather than swiftly pursue the new course of action. Likewise, EP contracts can extend years or even decades. With no explicit stipulations from the government that the prime contractor integrate innovative new technologies over the course of the contract, what incentive does the prime have to do so? In fact, if new innovations have the potential to reduce the government's dependency on legacy aspects of their system, they could be incentivized to thwart the diffusion of innovation, which comes at great cost to America's national security. This misalignment also presents itself for many of the large private companies. For instance, AM General is owned by a private equity firm. Generally speaking, PE funds are incentivized to leverage balance sheets, reduce headcount, and otherwise increase profitability to generate a higher internal rate of return. These objectives may not align with the best interests of a defense end user. Furthermore, there can be limited transparency regarding the provenance of the fund's limited partners, meaning there's a risk of nefarious LPs actually gaining information about critical defense technologies via their investments. Next slide, please. To the extent the DoD continues to direct substantial contract dollars into major weapon systems, these misaligned incentives must be addressed. We recommend that the DoD, the current administration, and policymakers establish a task force focused specifically on major weapon systems. One focal point for this task force should be addressing the fundamental disconnect between the needs of the military, the best interests of the external suppliers it relies on, and the taxpayers that fund this work. Additionally, today's asymmetric warfare challenges the relevance of traditional large-scale weapon systems in general. For instance, low-cost drone swarms have the ability to handicap or even down multi-billion-dollar assets. Based on our analysis, this new reality does not appear to have materially impacted resourcing for EPs. In what ways, then, is the DoD responding? The largest defense contractors exert tremendous influence over the development of defense technologies. Given that they stand to lose billions in revenue if the DoD changes course, what other voices can participate in this conversation to ensure it remains objective? For many people that devote years in military or civil service, the logical next step in their career is to work for a defense contractor. Their skills are transferable and they understand the customer. However, to the extent that people are concerned about career opportunities after service, it's critical to consider how this revolving door may affect their objectivity in evaluating performance and making contracting decisions. Now, regardless of changes to the threat landscape, major weapon systems remain critical to American military dominance, both tactically and defensively. It's essential that stakeholders involved in resourcing and delivering these systems protect their integrity at all costs. Doing so demands difficult conversations about the relationship between the public and private sectors and what new incentives and rules should be implemented to ensure that parties' priorities align. Thank you.
Amanda, before we move over to Sam, anybody that knows who has been attending these conferences over the years knows that you are a data whiz and you always have great data to present every year. So what additional, perhaps not currently reported information is there in the public realm that could be valuable in expanding into this type of analysis?
That great question, and I do owe a hat tip to my co-author Alex, who I believe is on the line here and is our chief data officer. So the lowest hanging fruit is more comprehensive lower tier supplier data. So we currently have access to subcontracting data via USA spending. We made the decision not to incorporate that into this analysis for several reasons, one of which is the fact that it's not as comprehensively reported as the prime contractor data. So enforcing stricter requirements on full transparency at the second tier level will dramatically improve this analysis. I would imagine that a substantial portion of the many billions of dollars directed into these primes trickles down into lower tier suppliers. And there's a lot of debate around whether it poses a security risk to publicly report third and fourth tier supplier data. And I think there are merits to both sides of that conversation. However, for programs as large as these major weapon systems, perhaps there could be a carve out where lower tier supplier data is in fact required to be reported.
Thanks, Amanda. And I'm sure there will be many, many more questions when we are done. So get
Wonderful.
ready. If we can now turn this over to Sam, please.
Why don't we move to the next slide? Before I dig in to the presentation, just a quick background on the Emerging Technologies Institute. We are part of the National Defense Industrial Association, and we have a big conference coming up in August. We focus on emerging technology trends in U.S. Defense sector, and let's move forward. The focus of this research is really how private capital is already working within the defense industrial base and starting to think about what the emerging trends are that could potentially be taken advantage of to expand that role and further strengthen the defense industrial base with private capital. When we started taking a look at this, we realized a lot of folks are really interested in the role of private capital in the DIB. There's been a lot more capital flowing into the defense industrial base in the last couple of years. But when folks talk about private capital, there are a lot of different things, different types of tactics that fall within the category of really using private capital to strengthen national defense. So we wanted to take a structured look at what's happening and what's worked well. The approach that I took was to go in and interview folks from across this space. It's a really diverse set of stakeholders who interact here. So of course, there are the investors themselves, including private equity, venture capital, commercial banking. There are a lot of different kinds of capital that are involved in the defense industrial base. The companies themselves, which use the capital, of course, and then the government personnel who are involved with working with those contractors and applying their capital to government purposes. And let's move on. Before we dig into the findings, I just wanted to go over a couple of big questions. Which, first of all, is why does this matter? What is the importance of private capital, and why should DoD care? On the left, you can see the National Defense Industrial Strategy, released a couple of years ago, noted that private capital could be a potential strategic tool for the Department of Defense in the future. There are a couple of reasons for this. At the very top of the list there, you can see that one of our adversaries has about double the rate of investment across their economy, with about the same size GDP as the United States, give or take. If you have larger volumes of investment capital in your economy, you end up with greater production capability year over year. Those are factories and dual use capabilities. There are other reasons why private capital is important. Private capital, of course, can support capital expenditures and R&D in a particular company. Private capital is critical to providing exits and making a liquid market that folks are willing to enter. And many companies in the defense industrial base, as it turns out, have fragility having to do with the access to capital. And so private capital is essential to maintaining the resilience of defense supply chains. Another interesting thing is that private investors often are really experts in commercialization. So if the Defense Department wants to increase the rate of technology transition, investors can be really part of an expert team to make that happen. Next slide, please. Another important thing to think about is just the overall size of the current state. This shows the amount of private capital approximately flowing into the US national security sector each year. I say approximately because most of the dollars that are invested in the sector are in private transactions, which are not publicly reported. And so different market intelligence firms and analysts use different tactics to try and understand how much capital is actually flowing into the sector. So these numbers should be taken with a grain of salt, although they do point directionally to approximately the amount of capital and the order of magnitude. What you can see is there are a couple of major finance streams at play at the bottom there in the blue. That is the large publicly traded defense firms and how much they invest. That's publicly reported. Venture capital is another one folks are really interested in. That's the orange. And then mergers and acquisitions, that refers to private equity acquisitions as well as strategic acquisitions. Each of these lines is probably a little bit bigger because the amount of information that can be captured is limited by the fact that these are mostly private transactions. But I do believe this gives you a sense of the order of magnitude of the amount of capital that's already flowing in. So pretty substantial. You can see about $100 billion, give or take, given the year. Next slide, please. So when I took a look at the different tactics that are used currently by DoD to coordinate with private capital, they really ended up falling into three buckets. And these were number one, demand signal enhancement. I'll go through in a moment and talk about some examples of each of these. Demand signal enhancement, as Moshe mentioned earlier, is a really key way that DoD communicates to the private sector. Ultimately, of course, investors are not going to invest in a company or an opportunity if there's not a demand signal because they won't be able to get their return on investment. So that's really number one most important tactic. Number two is a tactic called catalytic capital. And this is when the Defense Department uses tactics to actually directly incentivize investors to participate in some kind of a transaction. The last one is deal-making capability. So to do any of these tactics, there's a couple of baseline capabilities that are really required to support any kind of engagement that DoD does with a company that's investor-backed or with an investment firm. Next slide, please. To talk about demand signal, it's helpful to understand how investors see the world. They look at investments as a series of cash flows, and the positive cash flows have to be larger than the negative cash flows in order to have a positive return on investment. So the DoD and government has one way of looking at transactions and contracts. From an investment point of view, this is how they look at a contract value over time. And so the two most important things when showing a demand signal, if you look at the world this way, number one is risk. If you can reduce risk, then that makes the demand signal more appealing. Number two, a phenomenon called the time value of money, which means from an investor point of view, cash flows that arrive sooner in time are actually valued more highly. So if you can speed up time to market for a firm that's investor-backed, that's going to make them more financeable from an investment perspective. Next slide, please. Here are the different sub-tactics that fall under demand signal enhancement. We won't go through each one, but a couple interesting ones. Memoranda of Understanding, MOUs. This is a tactic that's been used to clarify demand signal for companies and investors working with the Defense Department in places like AFWorks. Prizes are another tactic for showing a very clear, predictable demand signal. Multi-year appropriation and multi-year procurement, of course, are a way of showing very clear demand signal to companies. So there are a whole range of tactics here under that demand signal enhancement tactic. Next slide, please. For a very specific example, one that we looked at in the paper was called demand aggregation. And this is where the Department of Defense was actually able to combine its demand signal with private sector chemical purchasers and show chemical production companies that there was actually a large joint commercial and government demand signal that justified upfront investment in chemicals, onshore chemicals production. And you can see there was actually a 25-to-1 private investor to government investment. So very, very large amount of private capital, given the amount of government capital that came into the project. Next slide, please. This second tactic is catalytic capital. If you look at the second bullet there, federal, state, and local credit programs, this is one of those categories where the Office of Strategic Capital falls. These are tools that can be used to directly incentivize companies to raise more capital and investors to participate in government-facing transactions. Next slide, please. For an example of this, there's the AFWorks StratFi program, where they directly match investor dollars. In this example, Expo matched private capital raised from a venture capitalist against government dollars. So that directly incentivized the company to raise venture capital and use it for government-facing projects that ultimately has resulted in a capability that the Department of the Navy has depended on for solid rocket motors. Next slide, please. And the last piece here is those deal-making capabilities. The one that I would highlight here is that third bullet, which is data and information technology tools. As it turns out, in the private sector, in the investment community, and also among investor-backed companies, there are a range of tools that are used to understand the commercial investment market, things like what the cost of capital is, which investors are interested in what topic. All of those things are available in the private sector. They're less commonly used in the Department of Defense. And so if government is going to continue its involvement with trying to engage more private capital, those are the kind of tools that are going to be increasingly important to help government stay informed and really be an informed negotiator in this sector. Next slide. So our next steps here will be to work towards potential recommendations. We think there's a lot that can be done to enhance the way DoD is already doing things and build on these successes. We're going to be holding a short course at NDIA and ultimately build out those recommendations. So please reach out if you'd like to contribute.
Thank you so much, Sam. I know there are some questions that are starting to pop up, so we'll definitely get to those in the Q&A. For those of you that haven't known Sam before, this presentation, the data is exactly what we would expect. This is great work, Sam, and it's always been a pleasure to work with you. I do want to ask one question before I go to Lindsay, but before I ask a question, I made the observation that the tactics that you talk about seem to all be grounded in one way or another in communication and collaboration. So thank you for just teeing that up for me. I appreciate that. But you're talking about how much money there has been in VC and private capital and all those. If DoD were to leverage the tactics you're talking about, take full advantage of them, how much more capital is there potentially at the disposal?
I think it's important to think back to that slide showing the amount of capital that's already invested. So there's a lot of capital that's already engaged on the order of magnitude of $100 billion per year. And if you applied some of the tactics that I looked at to potentially make the DoD even more of an attractive market, you could imagine building on that in a marginal way within that range of order of magnitude. Now, if you take a broader look at the private investment market, as many know, it's very, very large. There are tens of trillions of dollars every year that are invested across the American and global economy. So there is a very large and vibrant market out there that can be tapped. However, the determinants of whether or not that capital will enter DoD ultimately depends on how large the US and global defense market is. And then there are other structural factors that DoD can't control. Things like the interest rate across the economy, which currently has gotten higher, makes it a little bit less appealing. It makes the cost of capital higher for companies and a more competitive marketplace for DoD to enter. And things like macroeconomic policies like tax structure. So in order to dramatically change the amount of capital being invested, there are some macroeconomic policy things that are outside the scope of DoD. But within that set amount of capital that's already flowing in, I think there's a real opportunity to make a marginal but significant difference.
I don't know, that sounds like a great follow-on paper for next year, Sam. I can't wait. Now let's turn it over to Lindsay, please.
Great, thank you. Hi, my name is Lindsay Croft. I am a senior analyst at the Government Accountability Office, working out of our Contracting and National Security Acquisitions team, where we regularly report on Navy shipbuilding. I worked there for nearly a decade, participating in our work on the nuclear triad, Columbia-class submarine, and most recently, the ship industrial base. As you can see, this presentation is based on a full-length GAO report that contains a lot of additional details, including the names of quite a number of people who participated in writing this report. All the graphics you'll see in this presentation also appear in the report, so if you wanted to see them in a larger size and in their more full context, I would direct you to the report by the same name as this presentation. Next slide, please. For scene setting, I just wanted to start out with a look at what the industrial base looks like. So more broadly, the defense industrial base is divided into tiers, with the top tiers being prime contractors and their major subcontractors, and then lower level tiers being suppliers for supplies and materials. And so that includes a wide number of companies, but when you hone down to the prime contractors for Navy shipbuilding, it's actually quite a limited number of companies. The Navy has used primarily only 7 shipbuilders to build its major battle force ships. And some of these shipbuilders are highly specialized in ways that can constrain and dictate the types of ships they build. I think one key example of this is out of these 7 major shipbuilders, there are only 2 that construct the nation's nuclear-powered vessels, so things like nuclear-powered ships and submarines. And notably, there are some barriers. Notably, there are some barriers to increasing the size of the industrial base. One is that the overall number of domestic shipbuilders is limited. So while you'll see in the Navy shipbuilding plans that they're reflecting that the commercial shipbuilding industry could build some of their ships, such as auxiliary and support ships, it also notes that the commercial shipbuilding industry in the United States has atrophied. So there are some commercial shipbuilders, there are some shipbuilders doing shipbuilding for MARAD or the Coast Guard, but the overall number is limited. One additional barrier to entry is cost. So the existing shipbuilders that you'll see here, they have purchased specialized tooling and equipment, developed specific processes to build specific types of ships, and any new entrants to the market space would need to make similar types of investments. And I think these limitations are important to remember as we look further into the state of the industrial base for shipbuilding. But first, on the next slide, we'll take a quick look at what the industrial base for ship repair looks like. Here, I just wanted to note that we are not looking at the organic industrial base, which I think is fairly commonly thought of, and those are government-owned facilities like public shipyards where submarines are repaired. Here too, we're looking at what private industry brings to bear, and specifically honing in on a particular type of repair called complex ship repair, in which there's a subset of companies with a validated capability that can do major ship repair periods. And as of May 2024, there were 12 companies that could conduct these types of repairs, with some companies being able to conduct repairs in more than one of the 5 major fleet concentration areas, which is what you'll see on the map. The private sector industrial base for ship repair has actually expanded in recent years, and the Navy attributes that improvement to some extent to changes in its contracting strategy that it made in 2015, which it has stated has increased competition for ship repair periods. And I think that's of note as a comparison to shipbuilding, in which the Navy often uses other than full and open competition to award those contracts. In ship repair, there are often enough companies that there can be multiple companies competing for any given repair period. Now on our next slide, on slide 4, we'll examine how the industrial base has been performing in shipbuilding. So the Navy's fiscal year 2025 shipbuilding plan states that it is based on an assumption that private industry will be producing future ships on time and on budget. But this is not an assumption that's grounded in historical trends. GAO has a long history of reporting on ships that are behind target and behind schedule. And you can see that our analysis here shows that most of the Navy ships under construction were delayed. The delays you see here go beyond the delays that the Navy reported in its 45-day shipbuilding review from last year. And for many ship classes, they're going up to the 3-year range. And this ties to the fact that the Navy has not been able to sustain an increase to its fleet size over the past 2 decades. So we see that the Navy shipbuilding plans are consistently projecting a greater volume of fleet size than what the industrial base can achieve. And I just wanted to note that it would take even more than that to get to where the Navy wants to go. So where in 2013, we saw the private industry deliver 7 ships, to get to the Navy's optimal fleet size plan, they would need to be able to deliver 13 ships a year, every year for the next 30 years to reach that optimal fleet size plan. On the next slide, we'll see that there's a similar story for ship repair, and that the private industrial base has not been meeting the Navy's goals for schedule. So in fiscal year 2023, for example, it was only 36% of non-nuclear repair periods that were completed on time. But notably here, there have been some improvements in recent years. So we saw that between 2019 and 2022, the average days of delays were trending downward. On our next slide, we can turn our attention to some of the industrial-based challenges that make it difficult for private industry to meet these goals, specifically as they pertain to infrastructure and workforce. On the shipbuilding side, you'll see that there are challenges associated with infrastructure. A key example here is that some of the shipyards lack physical space to conduct all of their work, and at the same time, sometimes lack the workforce to conduct that work. That is leading many shipbuilders to look toward outsourcing as a solution to increase their capacity. And I just want to note there that GAO's prior work that oversight at outsourcing facilities is critical to avoiding delays under those circumstances, because if there are quality problems, quality needs are going unmet, rework could be a cause of additional delay. On the ship repair, to just pause on workforce for a second for shipbuilding, I can go through some of the factors that we looked at there. For example, shifting demographics in which there are fewer trade employees entering the workforce than are retiring. We're also seeing recruitment and retention problems, and both of those things combined can lead to greener staff at the shipyards. So folks that just need time to be able to gain proficiency in their new roles. In our analysis in ship repair, for infrastructure capacity, we found that there is actually sufficient capacity to meet the Navy's planned repair workload through at least fiscal year 2026. But there, we also see that there's not necessarily enough capacity for unplanned work, like emergent repairs. Say, for example, there's a ship collision that needs a repair, or battle damage repairs. One major example of why this is a problem is the commander of the Pacific Fleet issued a memo in August of 2023 that called for additional dry docks in Pearl Harbor, and one reason being that there was no capacity for emergent repair work in that shipyard for at least half of the time through 2028. And that's a situation that the commander assessed as being particularly high risk. I think we can go to our next slide. And on this slide, we'll take a look at what DoD and the Navy are doing in efforts to mitigate these problems. And this is with a particular focus on how they're investing in the industrial base. So over a 10-year period, we saw that DoD had spent nearly $6 billion to support the industrial base, to include shipbuilders and their suppliers, with some of these investments targeted at things that I've mentioned as being trouble areas like infrastructure and workforce, and also in the supplier base. And then they have also requested additional billions of dollars to the tune of $12.6 billion through fiscal year 2028. That's not accounting for additional budget requests for the FY25 budget request, or any additional planned requests beyond that. On the next slide, you can see that in our report, we assessed the extent to which DoD has taken a look at how effective these investments have been. And we have found that they were not consistently tracking, monitoring, or fully assessing the effectiveness of those investments. I can give one example here, is that the Navy and DoD did not maintain full visibility across investments that they were making in different categories. So, for example, full visibility between investments in submarines and surface ships. But here, I do want to note that there are developments in this area, with the Navy taking actions to try to seek improvements, and we will get to those later in this presentation. On our next slide, you can see that we also found that the Navy did not have a long-term strategy for managing the industrial base. And having such a strategy could aid the Navy in many respects. And I think one key example here is that it could help the Navy navigate competing priorities that it has for the industrial base. So I can walk us through an example of this, in which the Navy, on one hand, seeks to increase competition in the industrial base. The Navy's fiscal year 2025 shipbuilding plan noted that the limited availability of companies that could compete for its shipbuilding contracts had effects such as progressively higher costs to the government on its contracts, greater fragility in the workforce, and reduced incentives for private industry to make investments in their own infrastructure. And I think, we can tie those back to some of the problem sets I was discussing earlier. So increasing the number of companies that can compete for shipbuilding contracts could aid the Navy in its goals of increasing the fleet size more quickly. However, the Navy has a competing priority here in which it wants to be able to preserve the capacity of existing shipbuilders and protect their viability so that they can continue to conduct work for the Navy. I think in this environment in which many of the shipbuilders are reliant on the Navy for their work, should they find that they lose a competitive award for a contract, they could struggle to remain viable. And having a ship industrial base strategy could help the Navy navigate competing priorities such as these. And then on our final slide, I know I mentioned earlier that there were some developments in this space in which the Navy is trying to make progress in these issues. In September of 2024, the Navy launched its new Maritime Industrial Base Program Office, and the Navy, according to the Navy, that office would be positioned to address some of the 6 recommendations we made in our report, including that it could be involved in developing a ship industrial base strategy or in providing an integrated approach to the funding that they're providing to surface ships and submarines. This new program office is fairly recent, having just started in September 2024, but GAO does have ongoing work in this area, and will be monitoring progress in this area. So I also wanted to mention that in addition to the report by the same name as this presentation, there are also forthcoming GAO work on things such as the trade workforce and Navy shipbuilding outcomes. So if this is an area of interest to you, there will be updated work on this coming out from GAO over time. Thank you.
Lindsay, thank you so much. As a former GAOer, it's great to have you on the panel. I worked on shipbuilding reports, and some of these findings are eerily familiar from more than 15 years ago. So the question I'm going to ask you then is, what steps can the Navy take to help the shipbuilding industry and the industrial base improve its performance so we're not here 15 years from now when you're giving almost the same presentation?
Yeah, I like that question. I think, so we made 6 recommendations in this report, and I will pick my favorite of them. And I think that it is my favorite because I think it's the most salient to like a pathway to enduring change for the Navy. And that is that the Navy develop a ship industrial base strategy. GAO's prior work lays out the elements that a good strategy should include. And that includes like identification of your problem set, establishment of goals, but also things really relevant to this area, like the identification of resources you need and how they should be targeted, the development of performance measures you can use to gauge your results. And as you mentioned, it is not a new finding that there are cost problems and schedule problems in Navy shipbuilding. And so the pathway to change needs to be a more systematic change rather than a reactive change. And so I think that an industrial-based strategy for the Navy is something that could position them to do that.
Thank you so much. So we do have some questions, so let's start with those. Annie Berg asked, for all of us, is anyone communicating with industry to address the highly likely surge need for mass-produced drones? And perhaps we can expand that, the capability for surge of anything. It doesn't only have to be drones, right? We need a lot of things like munitions we've seen in Ukraine. And that's for all of us. I will just start and then turn it over to other people to chime in on a potential negative communication. DoD has talked a lot about needing surge capacity and asking industry to step up and take that risk. But at the same time, excess manufacturing capability at contractors is not an allowable cost. And that is a message that DoD is sending by saying, yeah, we want you to build all this excess capacity, but that's not an allowable cost. Another example is DPA. It's capped at $750 million. And if the fund goes above that, the money goes away. That's already appropriated money, but the money goes away. That prevents DoD from doing guaranteed long-term buys. because you have to have the money obligated and sitting there. And if it accrues over a number of years to guarantee future buys, once it hits that cap, it's gone. So that's another example of a statute in that case that's saying, yeah, we want you to keep all this capability, but we're not going to actually guarantee you any selling. We're not going to actually allow you to do allowable costs. I would argue they're saying one thing, but the actions of policy are another. And let me open that up to anybody else who may have some thoughts. Okay, I can move on to the next question. Andrew, hi Andrew, it's good to hear from you. Asks, are there any specific solutions contained in some of the acquisition reform efforts that are there now, such as the Forged Act that was dropped in December by Senator Wicker, or some of the executive orders, or the PPE Commission, or the 809 panel, that would help address the problems that we've been talking about?
I could jump in here. Moshe would also be interested to hear your views, because I know Etherton has thought a lot about the Forged Act and the executive orders. From my point of view, both the Forged Act and many of the executive orders have a real focus on shifting to commerciality. And when you shift to commerciality, what you do is you have the potential of creating a situation where the DoD is buying an item that industry is also buying, the commercial industry is also buying. If you do that, what you're doing is you're expanding your demand signal. So from a private capital investment point of view, if the DoD starts buying more commercial items, that means it'll be easier to justify investments in onshore production of those items because there's a larger market that can be served as a total addressable market.
That's great. And I will jump in, Sam, and I may turn it back to you also as well. But in the Forged Act, there's language on value-based pricing. So currently, if you're a sole source contractor, in many instances, there's certified cost and pricing data that you have to do. TINA, as many refer to it, and that's profit off the cost. So it could happen in that construct that a company like a VC company invests money, spends $1 billion, and then comes to DoD and said, I've got something for you. I have a missile that is twice as lethal. It's 3 times the amount of targets simultaneously because it murders, and will save you 40%. And DoD may come back and say, that's great, I want to see your certified cost and pricing data, because if you charge more than 15% of manufacturing, let alone the R&D that you put into it, the DoD IG is going to say that you're price gouging the Department of Defense. And so what the Forged Act is saying there is, if DoD is getting more bang for less buck, what the value is to them, that is a message that we should be sending to industry. And it's not just about, we care about your profit margin, but we care about the value to us as well. I think that is a prime example of one of these reforms, in addition to what Sam says about commercial, of them trying to say, no, industry, we want to work with you. And more than that, VC, private capital, et cetera, we want you to invest, because Sam, how many of these companies are going to make those investments if what they're looking at is short-term 15% profits?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a little bit of a subtle point you're making, right? Which is that if you shift to a value-based or a fixed price milestone arrangement away from a cost accounting methodology with a percentage-based profit margin, what you can actually end up with is a situation where the per unit cost goes down, or the total cost of the purchase goes down for DoD, but the rate of profit for the company actually goes up. So what you have is a win-win situation that results in a more friendly environment for private investment and ultimately a lower cost for DoD. So there are those home run situations that are potentially available in that alternative pricing model.
Does anybody else want to jump in, or I can move to the next question?
Yeah, one quick point, and this is not to be political, but I think it's important to take a look at the moment we're in. And this isn't a specific act or one particular executive order, but what we've seen over the last 3 months is a thorough review of some very large defense contracts that have put some of the very large defense contractors into the hot seat. None of that has touched on major weapon systems yet, but I think it portends the possibility of what I would call sacred cows historically being faced with some real serious questions that may look a little bit like a thorough audit. And Moshe, it really harkens to your point in this last presentation. What's keeping us from having the same presentation in 15 years? And I think it comes down to ignoring some of the realities that come with, having a small number of very large companies dominate this system. And for the first time in my decade of being active in this space, we're seeing right now some pushback on these entrenched players, which I don't know where the boundaries of that will find themselves, but I could imagine that in the case of my paper with major weapon systems, that these programs could face scrutiny in line with some of the other DOGE work that's happening.
So Amanda, A, great points. B, point well taken. I'm going to save this presentation so I don't have to do one in 15 years. It's already ready.
Please, I'll be so depressed. I'll be so depressed.
Next question, which John King asked, and Lindsay, this is for you. He did say great presentation, and I want to point that out because you actually see that in a number of comments. So I'm not going to repeat that any time, but there is a general fantastic presentation and report, Lindsay. So thanks for that. The question ultimately is, what should NAVSEA do different to ensure that ships meet availability times?
That's an interesting question. So for ship repair availabilities meeting the timeliness and schedule, I don't think that we looked at what actions the Navy could take insofar as we were looking at like what the state of play for the industrial base was there. But I do think that we have prior reporting in GAO on recent changes to the contracting strategy that they had. Our latest report on that is from 2020, and there we found what the Navy was saying played out in that they were able to increase competition for some of those availabilities, and that they had seen to some extent reduced costs. The challenging point remained the schedule for those availabilities, and so it's really the schedule remains the sticky point for them. And I apologize that I don't have a better answer for how to improve that outcome. But I think that it's likely an area of future GAO investigation. And I think that's all I can provide. Thank you.
Let me ask this softball. Do we need another shipyard?
Another interesting and really tough question. So I think one thing that question underscores is that there really isn't like a quick on-off switch for, the industrial base struggled to deliver yesterday and then tomorrow we can make it better. The question of another shipyard, one interesting thing I think we're seeing, as I mentioned, is that many of the shipbuilders are looking to increase the amount of outsourcing they're doing as a way to alleviate the constraints they're facing. And I think that's important because it does loop additional players into the Navy shipbuilding space. But, as I mentioned previously, I think it's important to emphasize that does demand oversight to avoid, a proliferation of additional challenges there. And then I think it also, I mentioned that the Navy's got some competing priorities and its own views on it would be great to increase competition, and having an additional shipyard would certainly do that. But they also face the challenge of ensuring that the current shipbuilders they have remain viable to do that shipbuilding work for them in the future. So I think it really, not to foot stomp this too much, but I think having a strategy for how it addresses those types of challenges is important for the way that it manages its interactions with the industrial base.
Thanks. So Sam, we spoke to a lot of investors. What excites them and what worries them about the defense market and working with DoD?
We're in an interesting moment right now, and have been for a couple of years, where there's a lot of excitement in the U.S. investment community about investing in defense and dual-use technology. Frankly, I think there's a lot of patriotic sentiment. There's also a lot of excitement about what they call deep tech investments right now. We came out of an era where there was a huge focus on software-first strategies in the commercial investment community, especially in venture capital. Now we're seeing a major shift in that investment paradigm towards more hardware or combined hardware software solutions in the commercial industry. that model is much more similar to, I think, what a lot of defense products look like. And so that means there's a little bit more overlap in terms of what that investment community is used to. So I think there's a lot of excitement about the space. However, there are probably, unsurprisingly, a lot of investors who don't have a lot of deep experience working in the defense community. They may not be familiar with the defense budgeting process, PPBE process, government contracting language. And so there are the normal frustrations and uncertainties, I think, that anybody working in the sector is familiar with. Another thing is, as more investment has creeped into the sector, you've got a lot of different parts of DoD that are communicating with the investment sector. So a lot of investors have been to a lot of networking events, workshop events, things of that nature to try and learn how to work with different parts of DoD. Many of those haven't gone anywhere for many of those investors, so you end up getting a burnout effect. So there's a little bit of a risk here that investors, either who have actually invested money here or started to get interested and communicate with DoD, might feel like they lose interest if they aren't able to find a deal that they can invest in and feel good about.
Thanks. Amanda, the data that you did and the research that you did, how are other countries dealing with it? Do they do things the same, differently? Do you see similar trends? Have you looked at them? I don't need to put you on the spot, but I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and there's really a few they're not parallels, but there are a few examples that come to mind if we're really going to be radically honest about this situation. And one is in Israel. So in Israel, the largest defense contractors are in fact partially owned by the government. So the carpet matches the drapes. And I'm not here advocating for state-owned industry in the United States. I'm merely pointing out something that needs to be part of this conversation. How can you balance maximizing shareholder value if you have serious national security priorities? It's I don't believe there's a way to do that honestly if there isn't at least a component of these major corporations that is not answering to shareholders, but in fact is answering to defense priorities. So Israel does it. Then some of countries that we might view as problematic, like China and Russia, they have very different defense systems, and this idea of state-owned industry is permeates their culture. So it's no surprise that it's a component of their defense industrial base. Again, I'm not saying we should look to emulate that, but I do think it's a conversation worth having. And there's also this idea of sovereign wealth funds. So that would be another direction where you look at what countries around the world have a sovereign wealth fund that is active in the defense space. So that would be my starting point for a dialogue around looking globally at where we might learn things.
Excellent, thank you. Lindsay, if I can ask, so a couple of people were asking similar questions, so let me posit it this way. You talked a lot about the need for a Navy shipbuilding industrial-based strategy. Beyond the strategy, are there one or two or three specific ideas that the Navy could do, shipbuilders can do to start getting us on the right track and knocking down some of these barriers of being more efficient and effective?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question. I think, GAO has a number of recommendations for the Navy on how it can improve shipbuilding outcomes. And so I think we have looked to ways that the Navy can leverage commercial practices for shipbuilding or for manufacturing in general to improve their processes. So things like establishing your design before you're starting construction. So we have a number of recommendations, I think somewhere around 50 open recommendations that the Navy could implement to improve their processes, some of which are focused on these leading practices that I'm mentioning. So I think, they're not necessarily recommendations that directly pertain to its management of the industrial base, but improving shipbuilding overall that could result in better outcomes for cost and schedule both.
Has IT worked into any of these analyses or recommendations, including improving IT at depots or shipyards for sequencing and for improving both sequencing so we don't have deferred maintenance, as well as sequencing for parts and making sure they're in the right place at the right time. Has that come up at all?
We didn't focus on that specifically in our report. I will note one of my colleagues from GAO is presenting on modular open systems architecture later on. I think there's probably a touch point there. But I don't have anything additional for you on that.
Well, if that's the case, I already told Sam with his report to be next year. Lindsay, we've got a report next year, right? We're set. We're good. No, I appreciate that. So let me also ask this if I can, and it's to Sam and to Lindsay and Amanda. It's not necessarily directly related to your paper, but I know all the work that you've done. In fact, I quoted work that you've done in the paper I wrote this year. I think I also quoted you in the paper I did last year. So I know you're very familiar with this. We're in a moment of acquisition reform that Amanda, you talked about. To what extent are we tackling or need to tackle the workforce? And what role does that play in all of these issues, particularly the acquisition workforce? And we have only about 9 minutes, just to let you know. And let's start in the order of the presentations, because I really do want to hear what everyone has to say about this. We can start with you, Amanda, if that's okay.
Absolutely. I think it's critical. And I think when you talk about workforce, you need to think about requirements, measurable objectives, and rules. So it's not enough to talk about the importance of things moving faster. You actually have to hold the workforce accountable when it comes to contracting turnaround times. For instance, there need to be salient metrics that are continuously monitored, and they need to be clearly stated goals and requirements for these acquisition personnel to meet. And the same is true for I believe one of the things you cited in this paper relates to a paper we published, 5 years ago now, about how the DoD markets to industry, and less than 3% of solicitations are written in what a computer would describe as plain English. You can force the acquisition workforce to only upload solicitations, at least the description, that are written in plain English, especially today when we have these large language models. You can literally make it impossible for them to post a requirement that doesn't meet certain criteria to ensure that it's understandable by industry. So I think looking at these, maybe they're not the most glamorous changes, but they would actually begin to move the needle, and then holding these acquisitions personnel accountable for meeting new goals and not just trying to convince them of the importance of these things. Having a cultural shift will take a lot longer than saying, these are some new rules you need to follow, providing them with insight into where those rules came from, and hopefully they can get on board with it intellectually, but really forcing them to meet new standards. Oh, looks like you're on mute.
I am, thank you. It's funny you say that, because I remember a number of years ago reading about a vertical transportation contract. It was for elevators. It had just said that. But Sam, thoughts?
Absolutely. Yeah, when it comes to private capital specifically, a lot of the tactics that I identified are actually scattered across different offices within the department. They're not necessarily just connected to one office. And so if you want to increase the demand signal by partnering with private industry, or you want to try and find catalytic capital that can help support an opportunity, that's something that really requires an entrepreneurial mindset on the part of the program manager and the contracting officer in charge of engaging with a company. So that entrepreneurial mindset, I think, is going to be increasingly important when working with commercial firms, investor-backed firms, trying to help them understand why they should pay attention to a particular government opportunity. The other thing is those digital tools, right? Equipping the workforce with what passes for table stakes in the private sector for folks interacting with commercial tech companies and commercial investors. Those things are not part of the typical government toolkit. That's going to be increasingly important, equipping the workforce with those tools. And then leadership, of course, always critical. When you talk about different tactics that need to be brought together for a specific opportunity, always really helpful to have leadership that's bought in and that's able to orchestrate those different things and bring them to bear to help ultimately catalyze a project that benefits DoD.
Thanks, Sam. Lindsay?
Yeah, workforce was an enormously important portion of the challenges that we were addressing in our report. It was an across-the-board challenge across the shipyards. And I think of note, one of the things that we learned during the course of our review was that for the skilled trades, it can take between 3 and 5 years for someone to, skill up in their new role. And so that also means that it is a longer-term problem. If you're seeing, an increase in hiring across the board, you're also seeing a greener workforce that, faces challenges with proficiency. I think I mentioned those challenges for shipbuilding. We also found some challenges with ship repair related to workforce. The Navy's projections of the repair workload were such that there were certain fleet concentration areas where the demand for work exceeded the workforce volume. The challenge there has a little bit of a different flavor, however, because the Navy does have some flexibility on the repair side to change the timing or location of those repair periods. So it is a little bit less of a heightened problem than on the build side where it's more immediate.
Moshe, could I ask you from the communications perspective, what role does workforce play there?
Please. Yes. What was the question?
The previous question we were just addressing, I'm curious for your perspective on that when it comes to communications.
So I think workforce is the most important thing. Full stop. I've read virtually at least 50, 60 reports that have been written dating back almost 100 years on acquisition reform, and they all almost start the same way. The acquisition workforce is the most important element of acquisitions. Now let's talk about something else. And I have yet to see the report that actually focuses just on acquisitions. I've yet to see the panel or the commission on the acquisition workforce. I've seen the panel on contracting. I've seen the panel on IP. I've seen the panel on PPVE. I've seen the panel on streamlining acquisition. We're now seeing it on requirements, but I have never seen it on the workforce. If it is really the most important thing, maybe we should be spending a little bit more time digging into that as opposed to all these other things which are important, but let's start with the foundation. So that's what I would suggest. I think workforce, it's all about the workforce, personally. We have only 3 minutes left, so I'm going to pose a question. 2 minutes left, I've been told. I actually think it's 2.5 minutes, but fine. I'm going to pose a theoretical question, bridging two of them. So with shipbuilding and the maintenance, I wonder how we could leverage VC and private capital to come up with solutions to improve the shipbuilding. And at the same time, I wonder to what extent current people and contractors involved with shipbuilding are inhibited from coming up with ways to more effectively and efficiently do things because of the current rules like pass and plus contracts and all of those other things. We can't answer that in 30 seconds, but I hope Sam, Lindsay, maybe we can get together for a beer at some point and have this conversation, and we can invite everybody. We'll have a very big time with everyone who wants to come. I'll let you know when it is. But I do want to thank everybody. I want to thank Amanda and Sam and Lindsay, and most importantly, the Naval Postgraduate School for having us come, and everyone who attended today. And please, I think I speak for everybody to say, A, thank you for joining us, and B, if you want to follow up, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you very much.